In the grim darkness of the far future, death comes easily to most. For humanity, even the augmented super soldiers of the Adeptus Astartes eventually meet their end, their gene-enhanced bodies finally succumbing to the relentless grinding wheels of eternal warfare. The ancient Eldar, for all their psychic might and technological mastery, face the inevitable erosion of their souls, each death bringing them closer to the hungering maw of she who thirsts. Even the ageless Necrons, those skeletal machines that have endured for 60 million years, know that their ancient bodies slowly degrade, their memory engrams corrupting with each resurrection, until nothing remains but an empty shell, going through the motions of protocols written in an age long forgotten. But there is one species in this galaxy that knows no such natural decline, a race that laughs in the face of time itself, growing stronger, larger, and more dangerous with each passing year, rather than weaker. These are the Orcs, and they possess something that even the mightiest champions of chaos, or the God Emperor's finest warriors, cannot claim: true biological immortality. Yet this gift, if it can be called such, comes with a terrible price. An Orc who lives too long becomes something that terrifies even those who have stared into the eye of terror itself. They become legends written in violence, walking catastrophes that can bring entire sectors to their knees. Today, we delve into one of the most fascinating and disturbing aspects of Orc biology and culture. What happens when these green-skinned warriors of mayhem survive long enough to realize their full potential? What horrors await a galaxy that must face an Orc that has been fighting for centuries? The answer is more complex and more terrifying than you might imagine, and it begins with understanding something fundamental about what Orcs truly are beneath that crude armor and battle-scarred hide. The question itself seems almost absurd at first. Orcs die constantly. After all, they throw themselves into battle with reckless abandon, charging into gunfire with nothing but a guttural war cry and an unshakable belief in their own invincibility. They fight not just their enemies but each other, settling disputes with brutal efficiency and zero concern for concepts like fairness or honor. Every day, across 1 million worlds, Orcs perish in their thousands, torn apart by bolter fire, vaporized by plasma weapons, crushed beneath tank treads, or simply beaten to death by bigger Orcs who took exception to their attitude. Walk through any Imperial Guard barracks where veterans of Orc campaigns gather, and you'll hear stories that all follow similar patterns. Private conscripts describe hordes of green-skinned monsters charging across no man's land, falling in droves to lass fire and artillery, yet never stopping, never retreating, driven forward by something far more powerful than simple courage or discipline. Officers speak of tactical situations where any sane enemy would have withdrawn, but the Orcs pressed forward, seemingly unconcerned about casualties that would have broken human forces 10 times over. Even decorated veterans who have faced the horrors of chaos or the inscrutable technology of the Necrons will admit that there is something uniquely disturbing about fighting Orcs, something in their absolute fearlessness and eagerness for combat that transcends normal battlefield psychology. The mortality rate among Orcs is staggering when viewed through human metrics. A newly spawned Orc boy has perhaps a 1 in 10 chance of surviving their first year of existence. Of those that make it through that initial crucible, fewer than 1 in 100 will live to see a decade of continuous warfare. The attrition is relentless, brutal, and seemingly unsustainable. Yet Orc populations not only endure but thrive, spreading across the galaxy like a green plague that cannot be eradicated no matter how many are killed. The mathematics of their reproductive system, those endless spores released with every death, ensure that killing Orcs in large numbers does nothing to reduce their overall threat. If anything, it creates the conditions for more Orcs to spawn in the future. Yet despite this constant carnage, despite the fact that Orc society is built on a foundation of violence that would make a Khorne berserker nod with approval, some Orcs survive. They survive the first battle, and the second, and the 100th. They grow larger with each victory, their muscles swelling with power, their already formidable physiology adapting and evolving in response to the challenges they face. These survivors become nobs, the elite warriors and enforcers of Orc society. Some nobs become war bosses, the biggest and meanest Orcs in any given group, commanding through sheer physical dominance and a cunning that surprises those who underestimate greenskin intelligence. But what happens when a war boss keeps surviving? What becomes of an orc that fights for decades, then centuries? What happens when one of these creatures endures long enough to see empires rise and fall, to outlive entire generations of the enemies they were engineered to destroy? The answer to these questions takes us into territory that most Imperial scholars would rather not contemplate, because an ancient orc is not just a larger version of a young one. They become something fundamentally different, something that approaches the terrifying potential that the old ones originally designed when they created the species known as the Krork millions of years ago during the War in Heaven. The implications of orc longevity extend far beyond simple military threat assessments. These are creatures that were literally engineered to be the perfect soldiers, combining animal ferocity with fungal resilience and a dash of psychic potential that makes them unlike any other species in the galaxy. Understanding what happens when they achieve their full potential means understanding the very nature of what they are, how they grow, and why the only thing that has prevented the orcs from conquering the entire galaxy is the fact that they spend most of their time fighting each other. The biological foundation: fungus, flesh, and forever. To understand what happens when an orc lives too long, we must first understand what an orc actually is at the most fundamental biological level. These are not simply large, green-skinned humanoids with a penchant for violence. They are something far stranger, a hybrid life form that combines features from multiple kingdoms of life in ways that would make a magos biologis of the Adeptus Mechanicus spend decades in fascinated study, assuming they could overcome their revulsion long enough to conduct proper research. Orcs are, at their core, a symbiosis between animal and fungal life. Their cellular structure contains elements of both, creating a physiology that is simultaneously robust and flexible in ways that conventional biology cannot match. The green coloration of their skin, which has become the defining visual characteristic of the species, comes not from pigmentation in the conventional sense, but from chlorophyll within their cellular structure. This means that orcs, to some degree, photosynthesize. They can derive energy directly from light, supplementing whatever nutrition they obtain from eating. This gives them a tremendous advantage in sustained campaigns, as they require far less food than a comparable human army would need. The implications of this photosynthetic capability cannot be overstated. An orc warband can operate in environments where a human force would starve within weeks. They can be stranded on barren worlds, cut off from supply lines, and not only survive, but thrive. As long as there is light and something to fight, they will persist. This alone makes them nightmarishly difficult to defeat through conventional means like siege, warfare, or blockades. You cannot starve out an enemy that can literally feed on sunlight. But the photosynthesis is merely one aspect of their fungal nature. The more significant feature is their reproductive system, if it can even be called that. Orcs do not reproduce sexually. They do not have families or raise young in any sense that other species would recognize. Instead, they spread through spores, much like a mushroom releases millions of microscopic seeds into the wind. Every orc constantly releases these spores from their skin, but the process accelerates dramatically when an orc is injured or killed. A dying orc can release countless millions of spores into the surrounding environment, each one capable of developing into new orcoid life. These spores are remarkably resilient. They can survive in soil for decades, lying dormant until conditions are favorable for germination. When they do begin to grow, they develop through several stages, creating not just new orcs, but an entire ecosystem of orcoid life. The first to emerge are typically snotlings, small fungal creatures with minimal intelligence. Then come Gretchen, slightly larger and smarter, who serve as laborers and servants in orc society. Squigs of various types develop, ranging from tiny organisms to massive beasts, used for everything from food to living weapons. Finally, after sufficient time and nutrient availability, full orcs begin to emerge from the fungal growths. This reproductive system means that eradicating an orc infestation is extraordinarily difficult. You cannot simply kill all the orcs and consider the problem solved. Every battlefield where orcs have fought becomes contaminated with their spores, And unless the soil itself is sterilized through extreme measures like orbital bombardment or virus bombing, new orcs will eventually emerge. Worlds that were cleansed of greenskin presence centuries ago can suddenly face new invasions spawned from spores that survived underground, waiting patiently for conditions to support their growth. The regenerative capabilities of orc physiology are another crucial component of their biological immortality. Orcs heal at rates that would seem miraculous in other species. Wounds that would be fatal to a human close within hours for an orc. They have been observed losing limbs and continuing to fight, either having new limbs crudely grafted on by pain boys, orc surgeons, or simply having their wounds sealed with emergency patches and continuing as if nothing significant had occurred. Their pain tolerance is similarly extreme. What would send a human into shock from agony barely registers for an orc, allowing them to fight on through injuries that would incapacitate lesser beings. The cellular mechanics of this healing process are remarkable. When an orc sustains injury, specialized cells throughout their body immediately begin migrating to the wound site. These cells, which Imperial researchers have designated as regenerative mycelia due to their fungal characteristics, rapidly multiply and differentiate into whatever tissue type is needed. Muscle, skin, even bone can be regrown at speeds that seem to violate conventional biological limits. The energy requirements for this rapid healing should be prohibitive, but the orc's photosynthetic capabilities provide a constant stream of resources that can be diverted to repair processes without significantly impacting their combat effectiveness. What makes this regeneration even more impressive is that it seems to learn and adapt from each injury. An orc that survives a bolt round to the shoulder will develop thicker bone and denser muscle tissue in that area, making future injuries to the same location less likely to penetrate. This is not conscious adaptation or directed evolution in the sense that the orc chooses where to reinforce their body. Rather, it is an automatic response built into their cellular structure, their body recognizing points of vulnerability and strengthening them without requiring any input from the orc's conscious mind. Over time, an orc that survives many battles develops a body that is increasingly resistant to the specific types of damage they have previously encountered. Pain boys, those orcs with an innate genetic understanding of surgery and biology, can accelerate this process through their brutal medical interventions. They graft additional limbs onto orcs, add cybernetic enhancements with little regard for rejection or compatibility, and perform experimental procedures that would kill any other species but somehow work for greenskins. The success rate of these procedures is shockingly high, not because pain boys are skilled surgeons in the traditional sense, but because orc biology is so robust that it can adapt to and incorporate almost anything that gets attached to it. There are documented cases of orcs having weapons directly grafted to their arms, vehicles incorporated into their bodies, even entire portions of their anatomy replaced with mechanical components, and not only surviving but thriving with these modifications. This healing factor accelerates when an orc is actively engaged in combat. The excitement of battle triggers hormonal responses that enhance their already formidable regenerative abilities. Orcs have been documented surviving, being cut nearly in half, crushed by machinery, or riddled with dozens of bullet wounds, only to be found days later, larger and stronger than before, with their wounds reduced to mere scars. The Adeptus Mechanicus has theorized that this is related to the Gestalt psychic field that all orcs generate, but we will explore that aspect more deeply later. The skeletal structure of an orc is likewise engineered for survival. Their bones are significantly thicker and denser than human bones, providing both strength and protection. An orc's skull, in particular, is a fortress of bone that can withstand impacts that would pulp a human head. This has led to the famous orc saying that everything can be fixed by a good thump on the head, though this usually applies to their crude technology rather than medical treatment. Nevertheless, the durability of their skeletal structure means that orcs can survive falls, crashes, and collisions that would turn other species into a red smear. Their muscular system is equally impressive. Orc muscles are dense and powerful, packed with fast twitch and slow twitch fibers in proportions that give them both explosive strength and endurance. An average orc boy is stronger than an unaugmented human by a significant margin. capable of wielding weapons that would require two humans to lift and swinging them one-handed with casual ease. As orcs grow larger, this strength increases proportionally, meaning that the biggest orcs possess physical power that rivals or exceeds that of power armor-equipped space marines. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of orc biology is that they never stop growing. Unlike most species that reach a certain size at maturity and then maintain that size throughout their adult life, orcs continue to grow throughout their entire existence. This growth is not constant or uniform. It accelerates in response to certain conditions, particularly successful combat and the presence of other orcs. A young orc boy might stand around 5 or 6 feet tall, roughly human-sized, though considerably broader and more muscular. Give that same orc 10 years of constant warfare, and he might stand 7 feet tall with a build like a heavyweight wrestler. 50 years of survival and victory could see him at 8 or 9 feet, a hulking knob that towers over those around him. The growth mechanism appears to be triggered by a combination of factors. Combat stimulates the release of growth hormones in orc physiology. Victory in combat, particularly the defeat of large or powerful opponents, seems to accelerate growth even more. The presence of other orcs also plays a role, as the gestalt psychic field they generate appears to feed back into individual development. An orc fighting alone on a barren world might grow slowly if at all. That same orc, in the midst of a massive green crusade, surrounded by millions of his kind and engaged in constant warfare, could experience explosive growth in size and power. This growth extends not just to physical size but to mental capacity as well. Larger orcs are consistently described as being more intelligent, or at least more cunning, than smaller ones. This seems counterintuitive given that brain size does not correlate with intelligence in most species. But for orcs, it appears that their cognitive abilities genuinely increase as they grow. A young orc boy might struggle to grasp complex concepts and operates primarily on instinct and genetic memory. A nub has the cunning to plan ambushes and understand basic tactics. A war boss can coordinate multiple war bands, grasp strategic considerations, and even engage in a crude form of diplomacy when it suits their purposes. The most terrifying aspect of this endless growth potential is that there appears to be no biological limit. No orc has ever been observed dying of old age. The Imperium has records spanning 10,000 years, and in all that time, there is not a single documented case of an orc simply expiring from natural causes. They are killed constantly, of course, but never by the passage of time itself. This means that theoretically, an orc could live indefinitely, growing larger and more powerful with each passing year, limited only by their ability to survive the constant violence that defines their existence. The growth mechanism, how combat feeds evolution. The relationship between combat and orc growth is one of the most studied aspects of their biology, primarily because it explains so much about orc behavior and society. To understand what happens when an orc lives too long, we must understand how fighting literally makes them evolve into something greater. At the cellular level, combat triggers a cascade of hormonal responses in orc physiology. When an orc engages in violence, particularly the kind of brutal close-quarters combat that orcs favor, their bodies flood with chemicals that serve multiple purposes. These hormones increase pain tolerance, sharpen reflexes, enhance strength, and most importantly, trigger cellular growth and division. The more intense and prolonged the combat, the stronger these hormonal surges become. But it is not simply the act of fighting that drives growth. Victory matters. When an orc defeats an opponent, particularly one that was larger or more dangerous than themselves, something remarkable happens. The orc's body interprets this success as a signal that it needs to become larger to match or exceed the threats it faces. This is not a conscious process. An orc does not think, "I beat that big humie, I should grow bigger." Instead, their biology automatically responds to the success, accelerating growth patterns in ways that seem almost directed evolution. This mechanism becomes clearer when we observe orc society in action. In any group of orcs, there is a constant struggle for dominance. Smaller orcs defer to larger ones, not out of respect or cultural conditioning, but because their biology compels them to recognize that the bigger orc is more successful, more dangerous, and more worthy of leadership. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. The biggest orc in a group gets the best loot, the first choice of enemies to fight, and the most opportunities to prove himself in combat. These advantages lead to more victories, which trigger more growth, which reinforces their position at the top of the hierarchy. When a particularly ambitious orc challenges one of these dominant individuals and wins, they experience an explosive growth spurt. The act of defeating a superior opponent triggers such a massive hormonal response that the victor can literally grow inches taller within days. Their muscles swell with new mass, their bones thicken and lengthen. Their already formidable regenerative abilities go into overdrive, healing any injuries sustained during the fight and building new tissue at remarkable speed. Within a week or two, the victorious orc will be noticeably larger and stronger than they were before the challenge. This is how an orc boy becomes a knob. Through constant fighting, through defeating bigger opponents, through proving themselves in battle after battle, they grow until they tower over their former peers. A knob might be twice the size of a boy, standing 8 or 9 feet tall and weighing several hundred pounds of solid green muscle. Their voices deepen with their size, allowing them to bellow orders that cut through the chaos of battle. Their physical presence becomes intimidating even to other orcs, who instinctively recognize the knob's superiority through that gestalt psychic sense that all greenskins share. But the process does not stop at knob. Those knobs who continue to survive, who keep winning fights against ever more dangerous opponents, continue to grow. Eventually, one knob becomes so much larger than the others that there is no question who should be in charge. This is how a war boss emerges, not through election or inheritance, but through simple biological dominance. The war boss is the biggest orc in the warband, period. They might stand 10 feet tall or more, with arms like tree trunks and a jaw full of tusks that could bite through steel. They are living proof that in orc society, might truly does make right. The combat-driven growth mechanism also explains why orcs are so aggressive and battle-hungry. Fighting is not just something they enjoy or a cultural practice they maintain. It is a biological imperative, as fundamental as eating or breathing for other species. An orc that does not fight begins to suffer withdrawal symptoms. They become irritable and listless. Their growth stalls, or even reverses slightly. This creates a powerful evolutionary pressure for orcs to seek out combat constantly, ensuring that even in times of relative peace, they will fight among themselves to maintain their biological drives. This need for combat creates an interesting paradox. The conditions that allow an orc to survive long enough to realize their full potential, constant warfare and victory, are the same conditions that make long-term survival extremely dangerous. Every battle is a roll of the dice, a chance to grow stronger or a chance to die. An orc that fights for a century will have engaged in thousands of battles, and each one could have been their last. The fact that some orcs survive this gauntlet speaks to a combination of skill, luck, and the brutal efficiency of their biological design. Environmental factors also play a role in orc growth beyond simple combat. An orc living on a world with intense sunlight will grow faster than one in perpetual darkness thanks to their photosynthetic capabilities. Access to food, while not strictly necessary given their ability to derive energy from light, still aids growth when available. Orcs that consume plenty of meat, particularly from large creatures like squigs or enemy combatants, tend to grow faster than those subsisting primarily on photosynthesis. This has led to the observation that orc warbands that have conquered agricultural worlds or captured significant food supplies tend to produce larger warriors than those fighting on barren rocks or in the void of space. The presence of other orcs is perhaps the most significant environmental factor affecting growth. An orc fighting alone, even if victorious in every battle, will grow far more slowly than an orc fighting as part of a massive green crusade. This is where the gestalt psychic field that orcs generate becomes crucial. When millions of orcs gather together, all of them excited by the prospect of violence, all of them generating that background psychic energy, the field becomes so powerful that it begins to affect reality itself in measurable ways. Orcs caught up in this energy grow faster, fight harder, and become more dangerous than they would be individually. This Gestalt effect creates a terrifying feedback loop. As a Green Crusade grows in size, adding more orcs to its numbers, the psychic field strengthens. This stronger field causes all the orcs involved to grow faster and become more powerful. These larger, more powerful orcs are more successful in combat, which attracts even more orcs to the growing tide of green. The cycle continues, escalating, until you have the sort of massive invasions that can threaten entire sectors of space, led by war bosses who have grown to truly titanic proportions. The Gestalt field. Belief made reality. No discussion of orc growth and longevity can be complete without exploring the Gestalt psychic field that all orcs generate and contribute to. This field is perhaps the most remarkable and least understood aspect of orc biology, and it plays a crucial role in what happens when an orc lives long enough to achieve truly monstrous size and power. Every orc is psychic to some degree, though most are completely unaware of this fact. They generate a constant low-level psychic emission, a sort of background noise in the warp that individually amounts to very little. But orcs are never truly alone. Even a small mob of orcs generates a combined psychic field that has measurable effects on reality, and when you gather thousands or millions of them together, that field becomes powerful enough to warp the laws of physics in subtle but significant ways. The Gestalt field serves several purposes in orc society. Most fundamentally, it allows orcs to recognize hierarchy without conscious thought. When two orcs meet, they instinctively know which one is bigger and stronger through this psychic sense. This prevents constant fighting over dominance, as the smaller orc simply accepts the larger one's authority without needing to be beaten into submission first. Of course, if the size difference is minimal, disputes might still be settled with violence, but for the most part, the Gestalt field maintains a basic level of order in what would otherwise be complete chaos. The field also affects orc technology in fascinating ways. Orc machines are crude, ramshackle constructions that by all rights should not function. Their weapons are assembled from scrap metal, with minimal attention to proper engineering. Their vehicles are held together with shoddy welds and an alarming disregard for safety features. Their spacecraft often lack proper life support systems or any kind of sophisticated navigation equipment. Yet these contraptions work, at least well enough for orc purposes. And the reason appears to be the Gestalt psychic field. When an orc believes their weapon will fire, the Gestalt field makes it more likely that it actually will, even if the mechanisms involved are questionable at best. When an orc paints their vehicle red because they think red ones go faster, the Gestalt field actually makes that vehicle perform better, not because the paint has any special properties, but because the collective belief of orcs makes it so. This is not unlimited. Orcs cannot simply believe their way to victory over all obstacles, but within certain parameters, their collective faith in their technology makes it functional when it has no right to be. This psychic field grows stronger under specific conditions. Combat, particularly intense and exciting combat, amplifies the field dramatically. An orc mob that is winning fights, cutting through enemies, and having what they consider a good time generates far more psychic energy than one that is losing or bored. This excitement feeds back into their performance, making them hit harder, move faster, and fight with greater ferocity than they would otherwise. It is a form of positive feedback loop, where success breeds more success through purely psychic means. The presence of a particularly large and successful orc, like a war boss or warlord, acts as a focal point for the Gestalt field. These individuals do not just contribute to the field, they shape and direct it, often unconsciously. A charismatic war boss can inspire his boys to fight beyond their normal capabilities simply through the force of his psychic presence. The field around such leaders becomes so intense that it manifests as an almost tangible aura of menace and power. Humans who have faced such orcs report feeling an overwhelming sense of dread even before combat is joined, a primal terror response triggered by the psychic pressure emanating from the green-skinned commander. For those rare orcs who survive long enough to grow truly massive, the relationship with the Gestalt field becomes even more pronounced. An ancient war boss, who has led countless campaigns, does not just contribute to the field. They become a nexus for it. The combined belief and enthusiasm of millions of lesser orcs flows toward and through them, amplifying their already considerable abilities. This is why the largest orcs in history have been not just physically imposing, but also possessed of an almost supernatural presence that seems to bend reality around them. The Gestalt field also plays a role in orc growth beyond simply making combat more successful. There is evidence that the field itself can directly stimulate growth in orcs who are caught up in it. An orc fighting in the midst of a million other greenskins, all of them generating psychic energy, all of them excited by the prospect of violence, will grow faster than an orc fighting alone, even if their individual combat record is similar. The field seems to feed energy directly into the growth process, accelerating the cellular division and tissue development that makes orcs larger. This connection between the Gestalt field and growth creates another feedback loop that explains how the largest orcs in history reached such incredible sizes. As they grew larger through combat success, they attracted more followers. More followers meant a stronger Gestalt field. The stronger field accelerated their growth even more. Their even larger size attracted still more followers, and so on. Once this cycle begins, it can escalate rapidly, with a successful war boss growing from impressive to terrifying to legendary in the span of decades rather than centuries. The psychic field has other, stranger effects as well. Orcs, who spend enough time immersed in a powerful Gestalt field, sometimes develop unusual abilities. Some become weird boys, orcs who are acutely sensitive to the psychic energy around them and can channel it into devastating attacks. These unfortunate individuals act as lightning rods for the field, absorbing the ambient energy until they must release it or risk their heads exploding from the psychic pressure. Their powers are unpredictable and often as dangerous to nearby orcs as to enemies, but they can turn the tide of battle when properly directed. The influence of the Gestalt field on what happens when an orc lives too long cannot be overstated. An orc that survives for centuries is not simply an individual that has beaten the odds. They are a being that has been shaped by and has shaped the collective psychic energy of their species for an extended period. They have absorbed victory after victory, each success feeding the field and being fed by it in turn. They have become, in a sense, a living embodiment of everything that orcs believe makes a good boss. Huge, strong, cunning, and absolutely unstoppable. The hierarchy of size, from boy to boss. To understand what happens at the extreme end of orc longevity, we must first understand the normal progression of orc life, such as it is. Orc society is remarkably simple in its organizational structure, built entirely around a single principle: bigger is better. This size-based hierarchy creates a clear path from the lowliest orc boy to the mightiest war boss, and every step along that path is measured in blood, violence, and growth. The journey begins when an orc first emerges from the fungal spores that are their origin. These young orcs are small by greenskin standards, perhaps 5 or 6 feet tall when they first stand upright. They possess genetic memories implanted by the old ones millions of years ago, giving them instinctive knowledge of language, basic tool use, and most importantly, the understanding that they are meant to fight. These boy-sized orcs form the vast majority of any orc population, the rank-and-file warriors who make up the mobs that crash against enemy lines in green waves. An orc boy's existence is brutal and usually short. They fight constantly, not just against enemies, but against each other in the rough social dynamics of orc mobs. Disputes over loot, insults, boredom, or simply the desire to hit something all lead to fights. Most orc boys never grow beyond this stage. They die in their first real battle, cut down by enemy fire or crushed by vehicles, or they fall to larger orcs in disputes over status. The casualty rate among orc boys is staggering, with only a small percentage surviving long enough to grow significantly. But those orcs that do survive begin to change. Each successful fight triggers growth. Each victory adds inches to their height and pounds to their mass. Within a few years, a particularly successful orc boy might stand half a foot taller than their peers, their voice deeper, their muscles more developed. They start winning more fights through sheer physical advantage, which triggers more growth, which leads to more victories. The cycle accelerates, and before long, this orc is no longer just another boy but something more. The transition from boy to nob is not marked by ceremony or ritual. It happens organically, recognized when an orc grows large enough that others instinctively defer to them. A nob might stand 8 or 9 feet tall, sometimes even larger, with a build that makes them look like they were carved from green stone. They weigh several hundred pounds at minimum, all of it dense muscle and thick bone. Their hands are large enough to crush a human skull with ease, and their strength allows them to wield weapons that would require 2 or 3 regular orcs to lift. Nobs form the middle tier of orc society, the enforcers and lieutenants who maintain order through casual brutality. They lead mobs of boys into battle, barking orders and cracking heads when those orders are not followed quickly enough. They also form the bodyguard and inner circle of war bosses, competing with each other for favor and position, while simultaneously cooperating to maintain their collective dominance over the smaller orcs. Life as a nob is better than life as a boy, at least by orc standards. You get better weapons, better armor, first pick of loot, and the respect that comes from being big enough to crush anyone who shows disrespect. But even among nobs, the growth process continues for those who keep winning fights. Some nobs become particularly large, standing 10 feet tall or more, developing a cunning that extends beyond simple battlefield tactics to actual strategic thinking. These supersized nobs are the prime candidates to become war bosses themselves, and they watch their current leader carefully for any sign of weakness that might give them an opening to challenge for dominance. The transition from nob to war boss usually involves violence. When a war boss is killed or seriously weakened, the largest nobs in the warband immediately begin fighting each other for the right to take command. These battles are brutal and often fatal, with the losers either dying outright or being reduced to such a state that they fall back down the hierarchy to regular nob status, or even lower. The winner emerges as the new war boss, having proven through combat that they are the biggest and meanest orc present, and the warband follows them not out of loyalty, but because their biology demands recognition of superior size and strength. A typical war boss might stand 11 or 12 feet tall, a towering figure that makes even nobs look small by comparison. They possess strength that can tear apart armored vehicles with their bare hands, durability that allows them to shrug off wounds that would kill lesser orcs instantly, and a cunning that, while still crude by the standards of other species, is sophisticated enough to coordinate complex military campaigns. War bosses collect the best weapons their mech boys can build or steal, often wielding power claws that can crush tanks or massive guns that require hydraulic assistance just to aim. But war boss is not the final stage of orc development. Among war bosses, there are gradations of power. Small-time war bosses might command a few hundred or thousand orcs, controlling a single fortress or warband. Larger war bosses unite multiple tribes, commanding tens of thousands of greenskins in campaigns that threaten entire planets. The truly great war bosses, those who survive long enough and win enough victories to reach the absolute peak of orc potential, become known as warlords. These are orcs of such size and power that they can unite millions or even billions of their kind under their banner, launching green crusades that shake entire sectors of space. The progression from boy to war boss to warlord is not guaranteed or automatic. It requires constant victory in an environment where death lurks in every battle. An orc might fight for years without significant growth if they never defeat truly challenging opponents. Conversely, an orc that repeatedly beats bigger, stronger foes can experience rapid advancement up the hierarchy. The key factor is not time but successful violence, combat that pushes the orc to their limits and beyond. This size-based hierarchy has profound implications for what happens when an orc lives too long. An orc that survives for decades or centuries does not simply maintain their current size. They continue to grow as long as they continue to fight and win. This means that the oldest orcs, those who have beaten the odds for extended periods, are also the largest orcs. They are living monuments to violence, walking proof of what orcs can become when given enough time and enemies to overcome. The hierarchy also explains why truly ancient orcs are so dangerous beyond their physical size. An orc that has spent a century fighting their way to the top of the dominance ladder has faced every type of opponent, every kind of challenge that the galaxy can throw at them. They have learned from countless battles what works and what does not. They have developed a strategic cunning that combines orc aggression with actual forethought and planning. They command respect not just through size but through proven competence. And when they bellow orders, even the most aggressive nobs listen because they know that this boss has kept them alive and victorious through countless campaigns. Historical case study: the Beast and the Prime Orcs. To truly understand what happens when an orc lives too long and realizes the full potential of their species, we must examine the most terrifying example in recorded Imperial history: the Beast. This individual, or rather collection of individuals, represents the closest thing to the ancient Krork that the Old Ones originally created, and the War of the Beast that took place in the 32nd Millennium remains the largest orc threat that the Imperium has ever faced, surpassing even the Great Crusade against Ullanor that earned Horus the title of War Master. The War of the Beast began in the year 544 inches, the 32nd Millennium, during a period when the Imperium was relatively confident in its security. The disasters of the Horus heresy were old history. The traitor legions had been driven into the Eye of Terror, and humanity had enjoyed several thousand years of relative stability and expansion. The orcs were considered a manageable threat, troublesome certainly, but not an existential danger to the Imperium as a whole. This complacency would prove nearly fatal. The first signs that something was wrong came from the world of Ardamantua, located in the Segmentum Solar itself, just 6 weeks of warp travel from Terra. A shield company of Imperial Fist Space Marines had been dispatched to deal with what were believed to be routine Xenos incursions. What they found instead was an orc force, unlike anything in recent memory. The orcs were organized, sophisticated, and possessed technology that rivaled the Imperium's own. The Imperial Fists were annihilated almost to the last man, with only a handful of survivors managing to escape and bring warning of what was coming. That warning came too late. The orcs, unified under the leadership of an entity known simply as the Beast, had been preparing for this invasion for decades. They had conquered and colonized Ullanor itself, the ancient orc empire world that Horus had cleansed during the Great Crusade. They had constructed attack moons, vast mobile battle stations that functioned as both spacecraft and planetary siege weapons, capable of tearing through Imperial defenses with contemptuous ease. Most terrifying of all, they had achieved a level of coordination and strategic planning that orcs simply were not supposed to possess. When the full scale of the invasion became clear, the Imperium mobilized everything it could. Multiple Space Marine chapters were committed to the fighting. Vast armies of Imperial Guard were thrown into the meat grinder. The Adeptus Mechanicus contributed Titan legions and their mightiest war machines. Even the Sisters of Silence, the anti-Psyker warriors who had fought beside the Emperor himself during the Great Crusade, were brought out of their monastery fortresses to face this threat. It was not enough. The orcs swept through system after system, their advance seeming unstoppable. They besieged Terra itself, bringing one of their attack moons into orbit over humanity's throne world, demonstrating with absolute clarity that they had the power to destroy the Imperium's capital if they chose. The fact that they chose not to immediately do so was perhaps even more terrifying than if they had, because it suggested they were toying with their prey, demonstrating dominance rather than simply seeking to kill. Multiple attempts to assassinate the Beast and break the back of the invasion failed with horrific casualties. Imperial strike teams that penetrated to the heart of orc-held territory found themselves facing not just one beast, but multiple ones. Eventually, the awful truth became clear. The Beast was not a single individual, but 6 separate orcs, each one massive beyond comprehension, each leading their own legion of greenskins in perfect coordination with their brothers. These prime orcs, as they came to be known, were something out of nightmare. Contemporary accounts describe them as being the size of small buildings, towering over even dreadnoughts and causing the ground to shake with their footsteps. The largest of them, the one that would eventually be revealed as the true leader, stood at least 10 meters tall, perhaps even larger. To put that in perspective, a Space Marine in Terminator armor stands roughly 8 feet tall. The Beast was over 4 times that height, a mountain of green muscle and barely controlled violence wrapped in armor that would not have looked out of place on an Imperial Titan. But size was not the only thing that made the beast terrifying. These prime orcs possessed intelligence that rivaled and perhaps exceeded that of human commanders. They spoke fluent Gothic, demonstrating an understanding of human language and culture that was previously thought impossible for orcs. They engaged in sophisticated diplomacy, sending embassies to the Imperium to mock humanity's weakness and demand surrender. They coordinated vast military operations across multiple star systems with a precision that put many Imperial commanders to shame. The Prime Orcs' technology was equally advanced. They possessed functioning gravitational manipulation, allowing them to move their attack moons with ease despite their massive size. Their weapons included energy shields that could deflect even Titangent-class weapons, guns that fired projectiles the size of battle tanks, and armor that required sustained fire from multiple heavy weapons just to scratch. When Primarch Vulcan himself confronted one of the beasts in single combat, he found himself nearly overwhelmed by an opponent that matched him in strength and exceeded him in sheer mass. The war raged for years, devastating huge swaths of Imperial space and bringing the Imperium closer to defeat than at any time since the Horus Heresy. Entire Space Marine chapters were destroyed or reduced to a handful of survivors. Hundreds of worlds burned. Billions died. The financial and material cost of the conflict nearly bankrupted sectors and required the complete reorganization of the Imperium's military infrastructure. Victory, when it finally came, was achieved through desperate measures. The Imperial Fists, rebuilt from survivors of the chapter and reinforcements from their successor chapters, led a massive invasion of Ulanor itself. They brought with them Sisters of Silence and captured Orc Psychers, using these in a dangerous ritual designed to disrupt the Gestalt psychic field that empowered the Orc hordes. The gambit worked, but barely. One by one, the Prime Orcs were killed, each death coming at horrific cost in Imperial lives. The final beast was slain in a confrontation that required an entire chapter of Space Marines, supported by Sisters of Silence performing their psychic disruption ritual while the beast's guards were distracted. Even then, the creature nearly killed everyone present before finally falling. With the death of the last Prime Orc, the Green Crusade fractured and collapsed, the individual Orc warbands turning on each other in the absence of the unifying leadership that the beast had provided. The War of the Beast taught the Imperium several crucial lessons about what Orcs can become when given sufficient time to develop. First, it demonstrated that Orcs possess the potential to match or exceed the Imperium in technological sophistication if they have the leadership and resources to achieve it. Second, it showed that size in Orcs correlates not just with physical power, but with intelligence and strategic capability, suggesting that the largest Orcs are not simply bigger versions of Orc boys, but fundamentally different beings. Third, and perhaps most terrifying, it proved that the ancient Krork that the Old Ones created were not myth, but achievable reality, and that given the right circumstances, Orcs could reclaim that legacy. The aftermath of the war saw the creation of the Death Watch, the chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos, specifically to ensure that no Xenos threat could ever again grow to such proportions without the Imperium's knowledge. The fact that such measures were deemed necessary speaks to how close humanity came to destruction during those dark years. Modern marvel. Ghazghkull, Mag, Uruk, Thraka. If the beast represents the historical peak of what Orcs can become, then Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka represents the modern embodiment of that terrifying potential. Currently the most powerful Orc warboss in the galaxy, Ghazghkull has been active for over a century of Imperial time, and in that period, he has grown from a lowly Orc boy into something that many Imperial savants believe could eventually rival the beast himself, if given enough time. Ghazghkull's origin story is itself remarkable, and provides insight into how an exceptional Orc can rise to prominence. He was born from spores on the Orc-held world of Urk, starting life as a simple Orc boy in the armies of a warboss named Dregmek. His early career was unremarkable. He fought, like all Orcs fight, with enthusiasm and aggression, but nothing that particularly distinguished him from millions of other greenskins. Everything changed during a raid on automated defenses left behind by Dark Angel's Space Marines. During the battle, a bolt round struck Ghazghkull in the head, destroying 30% of his skull and pulping a significant portion of his brain. For most orcs, this would have been the end. For Ghazghkull, it was a beginning. He was found by Mad Doc Grotznik, one of the most infamous pain boys in orc history, a surgeon whose idea of medicine involves more enthusiasm than precision, but occasionally produces miraculous results. Grotznik rebuilt Ghazghkull's skull using adamantium plating, creating a metal cranium that protected what remained of his brain, while also providing structural support for the healing process. When Ghazghkull awoke from the surgery, he was different. He claimed to have received visions from the orc gods Gork and Mork themselves, visions of a united greenskin race crushing the galaxy beneath their boots. Whether these visions were genuine divine communication, hallucinations from his brain injury, or something else entirely remains a matter of debate. What is undeniable is that from that moment forward, Ghazghkull displayed a level of strategic brilliance and leadership ability that set him apart from other orcs. He began to methodically eliminate rivals, challenging and defeating the other warbosses on Urk one by one. Unlike typical orc power struggles, Ghazghkull did not simply beat his opponents and take their place. He united them under his banner, creating a council of clan bosses that would serve as his lieutenants in the campaigns to come. Within years, Ghazghkull had conquered all of Urk and united its orc population under his leadership. This alone would have been impressive, but it was only the beginning. Using the unifying threat of Urk's sun expanding into a red giant, Ghazghkull convinced millions of orcs to join his exodus from the planet, gathering a fleet that would become the core of what the Imperium would come to know as the Great Crusade of Ghazghkull. The First War for Armageddon, which began in 941 of the 41st Millennium, announced Ghazghkull's arrival on the galactic stage. His forces attacked the strategically crucial hive world of Armageddon, and only the intervention of 3 Space Marine chapters and the tactical genius of Commissar Yarrick prevented the planet's fall. But while the Imperium celebrated this victory, it was actually more of a tactical withdrawal by Ghazghkull. He had used Armageddon as a testing ground, evaluating Imperial defenses and training his subordinates in large-scale warfare. When he left, it was not in defeat, but as a general who had learned everything he needed from the engagement. For the next several decades, Ghazghkull waged war across multiple sectors, his forces appearing and disappearing with a mobility that suggested sophisticated understanding of warp navigation and strategic planning. His warband grew from thousands to millions, and Ghazghkull himself grew proportionally. Orcs who had fought beside him in his early campaigns and survived to serve him decades later reported that he had nearly doubled in size, going from a large knob to something approaching the scale of the legendary war bosses of history. During this period, Ghazghkull demonstrated capabilities that set him apart from even the most successful orc warbosses that had come before him. He established networks of subordinate warbosses across multiple systems, each commanding their own substantial forces, but all acknowledging Ghazghkull as their overall leader. This kind of sustained organizational structure is virtually unheard of in orc society, where leadership typically lasts only as long as the current boss can beat challengers into submission. Yet Ghazghkull maintained control not through constant displays of dominance, but through a combination of reputation, success, and what can only be described as charisma. His tactical acumen during this period was particularly noteworthy. Rather than simply throwing his forces at the strongest targets in typical orc fashion, Ghazghkull conducted what Imperial analysts recognized as systematic testing of Imperial defenses. He would attack secondary targets, probe response times, evaluate the quality of defenders, and then withdraw before the Imperium could bring sufficient force to bear. Each raid was a learning experience, data gathering that informed future operations. This methodical approach to warfare was so un-orc-like that several Imperial commanders initially refused to believe the reports, assuming that the greenskin attacks were random coincidence rather than coordinated strategy. The raids targeted a diverse array of objectives. Some struck at Imperial shipping lanes, disrupting supply lines and causing economic damage far out of proportion to the military forces involved. Others hit isolated fortress worlds, testing the defenses and occasionally capturing advanced Imperial technology that mech boys could study and adapt for Orc use. Still others ventured into Tau space or attacked other Orc territories, demonstrating that Ghazghkul's ambitions extended beyond simple anti-Imperial warfare to a broader vision of greenskin dominance throughout the galaxy. What made these campaigns particularly effective was Ghazghkul's apparent understanding of propaganda and psychological warfare. Each successful raid enhanced his reputation among Orcs across the galaxy. Stories spread of the war boss who could strike anywhere, who always won his fights, who was clearly favored by Gork and Mork themselves. This reputation drew more Orcs to his banner, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where success bred more success. Ambitious young Orcs saw in Ghazghkul a leader worth following, someone who could provide the constant warfare they craved while also ensuring victories and loot. Even Orcs who had never met Ghazghkul personally knew his name and respected his achievements. The Second War for Armageddon, which began exactly 57 years after the first, demonstrated how much Ghazghkul had evolved. His forces were better organized, better equipped, and more numerous than before. The campaign initially went so well that Ghazghkul conquered half the planet, establishing a degree of control that suggested he might actually succeed in taking the world entirely. Only the fact that he became bored with the stalemate that developed, combined with his continuing headaches and malaise from his old wound, caused him to eventually leave Armageddon again, seeking new challenges elsewhere in the galaxy. Current estimates place Ghazghkul's height at approximately 12 to 13 feet, possibly more when accounting for his mega armor. This makes him one of the largest Orcs currently active in the galaxy, rivaling the scale of ancient war bosses whose names have become legend. His strength is sufficient to tear apart power-armored space marines with his bare hands. His signature weapon, a massive power claw named Gork's Claw, can crush battle tanks with a single strike. He wields a weapon called Mork's Roar, a custom shooter so large that it requires targeting servos just to aim properly, firing shells the size of a human's torso. But Ghazghkul's physical size, impressive as it is not what makes him the most dangerous Orc in the galaxy. It is his intelligence and vision that truly set him apart. He speaks fluent High Gothic, demonstrating an understanding of human culture and psychology that allows him to negotiate, intimidate, and manipulate with a sophistication that most Orcs cannot approach. He has shown strategic patience, willing to retreat from battles he could win if he judges that the timing is not right for his larger plans. Most impressively, he has articulated a vision for the Orc race that extends beyond simple conquest, the unification of all greenskins under a single banner to wage the greatest green crusade the galaxy has ever seen. This vision is what makes Ghazghkul so terrifying to the Imperium. Previous Orc threats, even massive ones like the Beast, were ultimately containable because Orcs naturally fall to fighting among themselves without strong leadership to unite them. But Ghazghkul has demonstrated the ability to keep Orc factions working together for extended periods. He has shown that he can coordinate operations across vast distances, maintain supply lines, and execute complex strategic plans that most Imperial commanders would struggle to match. Recent events have only heightened concerns about Ghazghkul's potential. He was temporarily killed by the space wolf Ragnar Blackmane, decapitated in single combat after a battle that lasted 10 days. By all rights, this should have been the end. But Mad Doc Grotznik, Ghazghkul's original surgeon, had by this point grafted the war boss's head onto life support systems, turning him into something between an Orc and a machine. Ghazghkul survived, and within months was leading campaigns again, seemingly more powerful than before. The implications are staggering. Ghazghkul is currently estimated to be somewhere between 80 and 100 standard years old, still relatively young by the standards of the longest-lived Orcs in history. If he continues to survive and grow at his current rate for another century, he could easily reach the scale of the Beast. Given that he already demonstrates intelligence and strategic capability matching or exceeding the prime orcs, the prospect of what Ghazghkull might become, with additional decades of growth, is the subject of nightmares among those Imperial commanders who understand the threat he represents. More worrying still is that Ghazghkull shows no sign of slowing down. He continues to wage war with undiminished enthusiasm, his forces appearing throughout the galaxy in what seems to be a coordinated campaign to gather all orcs under his banner. Reports suggest he has been spotted in multiple war zones simultaneously, leading to speculation that he has either mastered some form of rapid transportation or, more disturbingly, that there are multiple orcs adopting his name and iconography in a loose federation reminiscent of the 6 prime orcs that made up the beast. Ghazghkull represents a living example of what happens when an orc lives long enough to approach their full potential. He demonstrates that extreme age in orcs correlates not just with size, but with increasing sophistication, intelligence, and strategic capability. He shows that an orc who survives for extended periods becomes something qualitatively different from younger members of their species. A being that combines the raw physical power of greenskin biology with cognitive abilities that approach or match the galaxy's most dangerous threats. The Dark Necessity. What happens without war? Having explored what happens when an orc lives long and successfully, we must now examine the opposite question. What happens to an orc that survives but does not fight? This might seem like a purely academic question, as finding an orc that voluntarily abstains from combat is nearly impossible. But there have been instances throughout history where orcs have been isolated from warfare for extended periods, either through imprisonment, stranding on barren worlds, or other circumstances that prevented them from engaging in their primary biological drive. The results are illuminating and disturbing. The most comprehensive data on this subject comes from Ordo Xenos, studies of captured orcs kept in containment for observation. When an orc is prevented from fighting, the effects manifest within days. Initially, the orc becomes increasingly agitated and aggressive, similar to a human suffering from drug withdrawal. They pace their containment area constantly, test barriers repeatedly, and engage in self-destructive behavior if given no other outlet for their violence. Their vocalizations become more frequent and aggressive, bellowing challenges and insults at their captors even when such behavior obviously accomplishes nothing. If the isolation from combat continues for weeks, physical changes become apparent. The orc begins to lose muscle mass, their impressive physiology deteriorating at a rate that suggests their body is literally consuming itself. Their skin, normally a vibrant green thanks to chlorophyll-rich cells, begins to pale and yellow, taking on a sickly appearance that disturbs even the researchers observing them. Their regenerative abilities diminish noticeably. Wounds that would normally close within hours take days to heal. Their posture slumps, their tusks seem to shrink slightly, and their overall presence diminishes in ways that are hard to quantify, but impossible to miss. The psychological changes are equally pronounced. Orcs kept in isolation become listless and depressed. If such human terms can be applied to greenskin psychology, they stop eating, stop vocalizing, and spend increasing amounts of time in a state that resembles sleep but is qualitatively different, more like a hibernation brought on by severe malnutrition. Their eyes, normally bright with aggression and enthusiasm, become dull and unfocused. The cognitive decline is rapid and severe. Orcs that could speak broken Gothic before containment lose language ability entirely. Their problem-solving capacity diminishes to near nothing. Most dramatically, the orc begins to shrink. This is not simply muscle wasting, though that is part of it. The actual skeletal structure seems to compress and diminish, as if the growth process that makes orcs larger was being run in reverse. An orc-nab kept in isolation for 3 months can lose a foot of height or more, regressing toward boy size, even though they cannot shrink below their mature skeletal dimensions entirely. The process appears to be the body desperately trying to reduce its resource requirements when the environmental inputs that drive orc growth are absent. If the isolation continues for years, the deterioration becomes terminal. Orcs so maintained eventually die, and autopsies reveal systematic organ failure similar to what might be seen in an animal that has starved to death. Despite the fact that the orcs were provided adequate nutrition and even light for photosynthesis, the conclusion drawn by Ordo Xenos researchers is that combat is not merely something orcs enjoy or have culturally evolved to prioritize. It is a fundamental biological necessity, as important to their survival as food and water are to humans. Without violence, an orc does not simply fail to grow, they actively die. This dark necessity explains much about orc behavior that might otherwise seem irrational. Their constant infighting, their tendency to start brawls over trivial matters, their excitement at the prospect of battle, even against overwhelming odds, all of this is driven by biological imperative rather than simple psychology. They fight because they must, because their bodies require the hormonal cascade that combat provides to maintain basic functionality. The implications for what happens when an orc lives too long are significant. An ancient orc has survived not just the physical dangers of battle, but the biological requirement for constant violence. They have found sufficient combat to maintain and enhance their growth for decades or centuries. This suggests that the oldest orcs are not just skilled or lucky, but exist in environments that provide endless opportunities for warfare. They have carved out niches where the fighting never stops, where there is always a worthy opponent to face and defeat. This requirement also creates a self-limiting mechanism on orc growth. An orc cannot simply hide in safety for centuries, waiting to emerge fully grown. They must constantly risk death in battle to maintain the growth process. Every fight is a gamble, a chance to grow stronger, or a chance to die. The oldest orcs are those who have won that gamble thousands of times consecutively, beating odds that would seem impossible to any rational analysis. There is also evidence that the quality of combat matters, not just the quantity. An orc that fights only weak opponents, even frequently, will not grow as fast as an orc that regularly faces dangerous challenges. This creates another layer of risk. As an orc becomes larger and more powerful, they must seek out ever more dangerous opponents to maintain their growth trajectory. A war boss cannot spend all their time crushing Gretchen and expect to continue growing. They need to fight space marines, vehicles, monstrous beasts, anything that poses a genuine threat to their existence. This escalation of risk is part of what makes ancient orcs so dangerous. They are not ancient because they played it safe. They are ancient because they consistently chose the most dangerous path and survived. An orc that has been fighting for a century has faced opponents that would make lesser warriors flee in terror, and they have beaten all of them. Their continued existence is proof of consistent victory against the deadliest enemies the galaxy can provide. The requirement for combat also explains why even the largest Green Crusades eventually fall apart. When a massive orc invasion conquers a sector, killing or driving off all resistance, the orcs are left with no one to fight but each other. Within months, the unified force begins to fracture as different warbands turn on one another to satisfy their biological need for violence. The irony is that orc success contains the seeds of orc failure. They cannot simply win and then maintain their empire in peace. Without external enemies, they become their own worst enemies. For the oldest orcs, this creates a peculiar curse. The more successful they are at conquest, the harder it becomes to find worthy opponents, and without worthy opponents, they cannot maintain their size and power. A war boss that completely dominates a region must constantly seek new challenges in new territories or risk beginning the slow decline that comes from insufficient combat. This drives the largest orcs to range far and wide, seeking ever greater wars to sustain themselves. The curse of endless battle. There is a certain tragic grandeur to what happens when an orc lives too long. They achieve something that most sentient beings would consider the ultimate success: effective immortality, ever-increasing power, and dominance over their peers. Yet this achievement comes wrapped in a curse that ensures they can never know peace, never know satisfaction, and never escape the cycle of violence that defines every moment of their existence. An orc that survives for centuries carries within them the weight of countless battles. Their body bears the scars of wounds that would have killed lesser beings, testaments to desperate struggles where they triumphed by the narrowest of margins. Their mind, such as it is, holds memories of victories and defeats, of worthy opponents and forgettable ones, of the endless parade of warfare that has consumed every day of their extended life. They have become living weapons, so perfectly adapted to combat that they have lost the capacity to be anything else. But here we must ask a question that human philosophers might ponder, but orcs themselves never would. Is this a curse or a blessing? From a human perspective, a life of nothing but violence and struggle seems nightmarish, an existence stripped of joy, art, love, or any of the things that make life worth living. Yet orcs are not humans. Their psychology is fundamentally alien, their values divorced from the concerns that occupy other intelligent species. For an orc, combat is not an unfortunate necessity or a tool to achieve other goals. Combat is the goal itself, the thing that gives their existence meaning and purpose. Consider the perspective of an ancient war boss who has fought for 100 years. They have experienced more violence than entire armies of shorter-lived species will see in their lifetimes. They have traveled across star systems, fought on 1,000 different worlds, faced enemies of every type and description. They have grown from a small boy to a towering giant, each inch of their height earned through victory in battle. Their name is known and feared across multiple sectors. Lesser orcs follow them not from compulsion, but from the recognition that this boss knows how to find good fights and win them. From the war boss's perspective, this is not a curse, but the fulfillment of everything they were designed to be. They are living the orc dream, fighting constantly, winning consistently, and getting bigger and stronger with each passing year. The fact that they cannot stop, that they will die if they cease the violence, is not a limitation but a feature. It ensures that their existence never becomes boring or stale, that there is always another opponent to face, another challenge to overcome, another opportunity to prove themselves the biggest and meanest orc around. Yet there are hints in the behavior of the oldest orcs that suggest something more complex might be happening beneath their brutal exterior. The largest war bosses throughout history have shown a tendency toward grand gestures and seemingly irrational decisions that suggest they might be seeking something beyond simple victory. The beast's decision to bring an attack moon to Terra, but not immediately destroy the planet, speaks to a desire for dramatic confrontation rather than efficient conquest. Ghazkul's periodic withdrawals from battles he could win suggests he is looking for something specific, some ultimate challenge that lesser conflicts cannot provide. There is a theory, proposed by some of the more philosophical members of the Ordo Xenos, that ancient orcs are searching for an opponent worthy of finally killing them. After centuries of crushing everything in their path, after growing so large and powerful that normal threats no longer pose any real danger, they seek out the galaxy's mightiest champions in hopes of finding a foe that can give them the battle they crave. Not a battle they will obviously win, but one where victory is uncertain, where they must fight with everything they have just to survive. This theory is supported by the way legendary orcs seem drawn to legendary opponents. The beast specifically sought confrontation with Primarch Vulcan, one of the Emperor's own sons and a warrior of myth-tier power. Ghazkul has developed a strange relationship with Commissar Yarrick, viewing the aged human as a worthy nemesis despite the massive physical disparity between them. Because Yarrick has repeatedly thwarted Ghazkul's plans through sheer determination and tactical brilliance. These ancient orcs could crush thousands of lesser opponents with ease, but they actively seek out the handful of beings who can actually challenge them. If this theory is correct, then the curse of being an ancient orc is not the necessity of constant combat, but the increasing difficulty of finding combat that matters. As they grow larger and more powerful, the pool of potential opponents worthy of their attention shrinks. Eventually, only the galaxy's absolute strongest can provide the challenge they need. Primarchs, daemon princes, greater daemons, hive tyrants. These become the only foes that can satisfy the ancient orcs' biological and psychological needs. This creates a spiral where success breeds dissatisfaction. Each victory over a worthy opponent eliminates that opponent as a future source of challenge. The orc grows larger and needs even more dangerous foes, but the supply of such foes is limited. There are only so many Primarchs, so many legendary champions, so many beings of sufficient power to threaten an ancient war boss. Eventually, the orc might find themselves the biggest and strongest creature in their entire region of space, surrounded by enemies too weak to provide the combat they require. What happens then? Do they begin to weaken from insufficient stimulation, their growth reversing as they shrink back down toward more common proportions? Do they embark on increasingly desperate searches for challenges, throwing themselves at odds so overwhelming that they finally meet their end? Or do they, in the darkest possibility, begin to understand on some level the futility of their existence, trapped in an immortal body that demands violence but can no longer find satisfaction in it? The evidence suggests that most ancient orcs never reach this crisis point because they die before getting there. The very battles they seek out to maintain their growth are the battles most likely to kill them. An orc that fights primarchs and daemon princes might win once, twice, even a dozen times. But eventually, the odds catch up. They face an opponent who is faster, stronger, or luckier, and their century-long winning streak ends in a moment of catastrophic violence. In a sense, the very mechanism that allows orcs to become ancient also ensures they rarely become truly ancient. The need for ever greater challenges leads them inevitably to the challenge that will finally end them. There is a certain poetry to this. The orcs were created by the Old Ones to be perfect soldiers, beings that lived only for war and grew stronger with every battle. The curse they bear is that this perfection of purpose leaves no room for anything else. They cannot retire from warfare. They cannot find satisfaction in peace. They must fight until they die, and the better they are at fighting, the more dangerous the opponents they must face, until inevitably they meet the one foe they cannot defeat. For the very few orcs that survive to truly ancient age, pushing past centuries of combat into their second or even third century of active warfare, there may be a terrible moment of understanding. As their intelligence grows with their size, as they develop the cognitive capacity to think beyond the immediate excitement of the next battle, they might begin to grasp the nature of their existence. They are trapped in a loop from which there is no escape, doomed to fight forever because their biology demands it, growing larger and stronger, but never truly progressing beyond the fundamental drive that defines their species. If such understanding comes, it does not bring change. An ancient orc cannot simply choose to stop fighting, any more than a human can choose to stop breathing. Their biology overrides any philosophical objections their enlarged brain might generate. They must continue the cycle, seeking out ever more dangerous opponents, growing ever larger, until the inevitable day when they finally meet the foe that can end their long existence. Theoretical limits and future implications. As we have explored the mechanics of orc growth and the examples of the most ancient greenskins in recorded history, a question naturally arises. Is there a limit to how large and powerful an orc can become? Or could one theoretically grow forever if they could somehow survive indefinitely? The answer to this question has profound implications for understanding the orc threat to the galaxy as a whole. From a purely biological standpoint, there should be limits to orc growth. Physics places constraints on how large a land-dwelling creature can become before their own mass becomes unmanageable. The square cube law dictates that as an organism doubles in size, its volume and mass increase by a factor of 8, but its skeletal cross-section only increases by a factor of 4. Eventually, an organism becomes so large that its own skeleton cannot support its weight, and it collapses under its own mass. Yet the beast appears to have exceeded these theoretical limits, standing 10 meters or more in height and still being capable of movement and combat. The prime orcs of that era functioned effectively despite having dimensions that should have made them unable to walk, let alone fight. This suggests that something beyond simple biology is at work. The gestalt psychic field that orcs generate may actually provide structural support, using telekinetic forces to supplement the physical strength of their bones and muscles. If this is the case, then the limit to orc growth is not physical but psychic, determined by how much gestalt energy can be focused through a single individual. The implications of this are staggering. It suggests that the largest orcs are not just benefiting from the psychic field, but are actually partially held together by it. They are as much psychic constructs as physical beings, their mass supported and sustained by the collective belief and enthusiasm of the millions of lesser orcs that follow them. This would explain how the beast could function despite apparent physical impossibilities. It also suggests that an ancient orc, separated from other members of their species, might actually begin to physically collapse as the psychic support structure dissipates. If the psychic field is indeed what allows the largest orcs to exceed normal biological limits, then the theoretical maximum size would be determined by how many orcs are contributing to that field and how much energy they are generating. During the War of the Beast, billions of orcs were unified under a single command structure, all of them excited by constant warfare, all of them generating psychic energy that fed back into their leaders. The prime orcs that resulted from this concentration of power were the largest orcs ever recorded. This suggests that with even more orcs, or with orcs even more unified and enthusiastic, still larger greenskins might be possible. The prospect is nightmarish. Imagine an orc warboss who unites not just billions, but trillions of greenskins under a single banner. Imagine the gestalt field generated by such a horde, all focused through a single dominant individual. Could such a being grow to rival the size of titans? Could they reach scales comparable to gargants, or even larger war machines? There may literally be no upper limit, as long as sufficient psychic energy can be channeled to support the growth. More concerning still is the question of what such growth means for the cognitive development of orcs. If larger size correlates with greater intelligence, as the evidence clearly suggests, then an orc that somehow grew beyond even the beast's scale might develop intelligence that rivals or exceeds the greatest minds in the galaxy. A building-sized orc with strategic genius comparable to primarchs or chaos gods would be an existential threat to the Imperium, on a scale that makes current orc invasions look trivial by comparison. But even if such extreme scenarios remain theoretical, the practical implications of what we know about orc longevity are dire enough. Ghazghkull is still growing. He continues to wage war across the galaxy, defeating enemies and absorbing their victories into his legend. He is actively working to unite all orcs under his banner, gathering the sort of massive following that would provide the psychic foundation for growth beyond anything seen since the Beast. If he succeeds, if he manages to create a unified green crusade involving billions or trillions of orcs, all focused on a single grand campaign, there is no reason to believe he could not eventually reach the scale and power of the prime orcs. The timescale involved makes this threat particularly insidious. Orc growth takes years or decades, not months or weeks. Ghazghkull has been active for roughly a century. If he survives for another century, continuing his current trajectory of growth and success, he will likely rival the Beast in physical size and exceed him in accumulated military experience. 2 centuries is nothing on the timescale of the Imperium, barely a historical footnote in a civilization that has endured for 10,000 years. Yet it might be sufficient time for Ghazghkull to transform from a major threat into an existential one. The Imperium's response to this threat has been inadequate, hampered by bureaucracy, internal conflicts, and the simple fact that orcs are viewed as a manageable nuisance rather than a species-ending danger. The lessons of the War of the Beast have been largely forgotten, despite the fact that they occurred relatively recently in Imperial history. The Death Watch exists to monitor and respond to Xenos threats, but they are stretched thin across a galaxy filled with dangers. The focus has been on Tyranids, Necrons, and Chaos, all of which present immediate and obvious threats. The slower-burning danger of what orcs can become, given sufficient time, has been neglected. There is also the question of whether killing ancient orcs even solves the problem. When a legendary warboss falls, the spores released by their death can spread across entire worlds. These spores carry genetic information that reflects their progenitor's size and success. The orcs that eventually grow from these spores inherit a legacy of conquest, starting life larger and more aggressive than normal orc boys. This means that killing an ancient orc might actually seed future generations with the potential to reach similar heights, creating a cycle where the greatest threats keep re-emerging in new forms. The only real solution would be complete eradication of orc spores from any world where ancient orcs have died, but this is practically impossible to achieve. Spores can remain viable in soil for decades. They survive in space, in vacuum, even in extreme heat or cold. Short of cracking a planet's crust with exterminatus-level bombardment, there is no way to guarantee that every spore has been destroyed. And the Imperium cannot afford to destroy every world where a major orc invasion has occurred. That would involve the loss of too many critical systems and resources. This creates a grim calculation for those Imperial commanders and Ordo Xenos agents who understand the full scope of the orc threat. They can kill individual war bosses, delay Green Crusades, buy time for humanity to address other crises, but they cannot permanently solve the orc problem because the biology of the species makes it unsolvable through military means. As long as orcs exist anywhere in the galaxy, there is the potential for one of them to survive long enough, win enough battles, unite enough of their kind to become the next beast, the next existential threat that brings humanity to the brink of extinction. The ultimate implication of orc longevity is that time itself is the enemy. Every year that passes is another year where exceptional orcs can grow larger. Every decade is another decade where ambitious war bosses can gather followers and resources. Every century is another century where the laws of probability make it more likely that the right combination of circumstances will produce another prime orc. The Imperium exists in a constant race against time, trying to suppress orc populations and eliminate rising war bosses before they can reach critical mass. It is a race that cannot be won permanently, only postponed, again and again, for as long as humanity can maintain the strength and vigilance to keep fighting. Conclusion. The eternal green tide. We return now to our original question. What happens when an orc lives too long? The answer, as we have explored through biology, history, and theoretical analysis, is both simple and terrifying. An orc that lives too long becomes exactly what the old ones designed their species to be. They become a perfect weapon of war, growing ever larger, ever stronger, ever more intelligent, fueled by an endless cycle of violence that they cannot escape, and would not choose to even if they could. These ancient orcs represent the peak of what greenskin biology can achieve. They are living proof that orcs possess the potential to rival or exceed any other species in physical power. They demonstrate that size in orcs correlates not just with strength but with sophistication of thought, suggesting that the largest greenskins are not simply bigger versions of their smaller kin, but fundamentally different beings that approach the cognitive capabilities of the galaxy's most advanced species while retaining all the raw ferocity that makes orcs so dangerous. The examples of the Beast and Gazkul show us that this potential is not merely theoretical. History has already witnessed what can happen when orcs achieve their full development, and the galaxy barely survived the experience. The War of the Beast came within a hair's breadth of destroying the Imperium entirely, saved only by desperate measures and sacrifices that required decades to recover from. Gazkul's current campaigns suggest that history may be preparing to repeat itself, with humanity potentially facing a second encounter with prime orc-level threats within the next century or two. The curse that binds these ancient warriors is that their greatest strength is also their fundamental weakness. They must fight to live, and fighting carries the constant risk of death. The more successful they become, the more dangerous the opponents they must face to maintain their growth. This creates a ceiling on orc potential, not through biological limits, but through the simple mathematics of risk. Eventually, every orc that has lived too long meets the challenge they cannot overcome, and their long existence ends in a moment of catastrophic violence. Yet even in death, they threaten the future. Their spores spread across worlds, carrying the genetic legacy of their success. New orcs grown from these spores inherit advantages that normal greenskins do not possess. The cycle continues, with each generation potentially producing new champions, who will begin their own climb toward legendary status. The threat never truly ends. It simply transforms, taking on new names and new faces, while remaining fundamentally unchanged in its nature. For the Imperium and the other species of the galaxy, the existence of ancient orcs represents a sword of Damocles hanging over every attempt at stability and peace. They are a reminder that in a galaxy of eternal warfare, time favors those species that are literally built for war. Humans age and die, their knowledge and skill lost with each generation. Eldar dwindle, their numbers reduced with each passing millennium. Tyranids can be beaten back, necrons can be destroyed, chaos can be resisted. But orcs simply grow larger, and the longer they survive, the more dangerous they become. The tragedy, if we can call it that, is that orcs themselves likely do not perceive their existence as tragic. They are living their purpose, doing exactly what they were designed to do. An ancient warboss that has fought for a century is not suffering through their existence but reveling in it. They have achieved something that most orcs never will: survival long enough to become truly massive, truly powerful, truly legendary. From their perspective, they are winning at life in the most fundamental way possible. This alien psychology makes them impossible to negotiate with in any meaningful sense. You cannot offer an ancient orc peace, because peace is death to them. You cannot bribe them with resources or territory, because they only value things that help them fight more effectively. You cannot frighten them with threats, because they actively seek out danger as a biological necessity. The only currency that matters to them is violence, and they have more of that than any other species can match. So what happens when an orc lives too long? They become a monument to warfare itself, a being so perfectly adapted to combat that they transcend the normal limitations of biology and approach something mythic. They grow until physics should prevent further growth, then grow beyond that through sheer psychic force. They fight until the odds say they should die, then keep fighting until the odds give up and accept that this particular greenskin is simply too mean to kill. They unite millions or billions of their kind through pure dominance, creating green crusades that shake the foundations of empires. And eventually, when they finally do fall, they leave behind a legacy that will spawn new generations of orcs, each carrying within them the potential to become just as legendary as their progenitor. The strategic implications of this biological immortality cannot be overstated. Every major military power in the galaxy must dedicate resources to containing and suppressing orc populations. Yet these efforts are ultimately futile in the long term. The Imperium maintains entire regiments whose sole purpose is responding to greenskin incursions. The Aeldari craftworlds regularly conduct raids on orc strongholds, trying to prevent the formation of massive green crusades before they can gain momentum. Even the Tau, despite their relative youth as a spacefaring civilization, have learned that orc threats must be addressed immediately and with overwhelming force, because any delay allows the greenskins to grow stronger. Yet despite these efforts, despite the countless resources poured into anti-orc operations, the greenskin threat continues to expand. Imperial records show a steady increase in orc activity over the past several millennia. Worlds that were cleansed of greenskin presence centuries ago find themselves facing new infestations as dormant spores finally germinate. Systems that have never before encountered orcs suddenly come under attack from migrating warbands seeking new fights. The green tide is rising, slowly but inexorably, and every year makes it more likely that the conditions will align for another beast-level threat to emerge. This creates a terrible dilemma for those charged with the galaxy's defense. Resources spent fighting orcs are resources not available for countering other threats. The Imperium faces invasion from all sides. Tyranid hive fleets from beyond the galactic rim. Necron tomb worlds awakening after eons of sleep. Chaos forces spilling from the Eye of Terror. Tau expansion in the eastern fringe. Each threat demands attention and military forces. Yet the orc menace cannot be ignored, because unlike these other dangers, orcs grow more dangerous with time rather than less. A Tyranid splinter fleet can be destroyed, its biomass denied to the hive mind. A Necron tomb world can be sealed or destroyed, removing that threat permanently. Even chaos incursions can be beaten back into the warp, but orcs persist, and every battle against them, whether victory or defeat, spreads more spores that will eventually produce more orcs. The universe is vast and ancient. In its long history, it has witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, the birth and death of species beyond counting. Yet, through all of this, the orcs persist. They survived the war in heaven that created them. They outlasted the old ones who designed them. They fought the Necrons to a standstill when those mechanical horrors were at the height of their power. They weathered the birth of Slaanesh and the fall of the Eldar. They have faced the Imperium of man for 10,000 years, and have only grown more numerous and more dangerous over time. The persistence of the orc species across such vast stretches of time speaks to the genius of their original design. The Old Ones, in their desperate war against the Necrontyr and their star god masters, needed soldiers who could fight indefinitely, who required minimal support, who would never surrender or lose morale. In the Krork, later degraded into the orcs we know today, they achieved that goal, perhaps too well. They created a species so perfectly adapted to warfare that it cannot be eradicated, only temporarily contained. Every weapon that makes them die easier also makes them spread faster through spore release. Every victory against them seeds future defeats. The ultimate weapon became an eternal plague. And the oldest among them, those that have lived too long and grown too large, stand as proof that the green tide will never truly be stopped. You can kill individual orcs. You can defeat specific invasions. You can even win entire wars against greenskin empires. But you cannot eliminate the species, and as long as orcs exist, there will always be the possibility that one of them will survive long enough to become the next legend, the next nightmare, the next prime orc that brings civilizations to their knees. This is what happens when an orc lives too long. They become inevitable. Not inevitable in any individual sense. Each ancient war boss can be killed given sufficient force and determination, but inevitable as a class, as a type, as a recurring nightmare that the galaxy will face again and again for as long as orcs exist. The beast was defeated, but there will be another beast. Ghazghkull might fall, but another Ghazghkull will rise. The names and faces change, but the fundamental threat remains constant. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. For humanity and most species, this is a curse, a terrible grinding existence that offers no hope of better days to come. But for orcs, it is paradise. War is what they were made for, what they live for, what they will die doing. And those few that live long enough to reach their full potential become living gods of warfare, terrible and magnificent in equal measure. Proof that in a galaxy of horrors, the simplest and most brutal approach can sometimes be the most effective. If you've enjoyed diving deep into the disturbing implications of orc biology and the nightmare scenario of what these green-skinned warriors become when given enough time to fully develop, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There's so much more to explore in the dark corners of Warhammer 40k lore, and I'll be bringing you more content that explores the factions, characters, and cosmic horrors that make this universe so compelling. Until next time, remember, in the 41st millennium, some threats don't diminish with time, they only grow stronger.